Good morning, I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation Magazine and AsianAviation.com. Today we're in conversation with Balu Ramachandran, the global head for the air business at Cleartrip. Balu, welcome to In Conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Matt. My pleasure to be here. Looking forward to this conversation.
Balu, aviation has been hammered. Everybody knows COVID-19 pandemic, international travel is basically at a standstill. Domestic travel's returning in some markets. Your company specializes in India, one of my favorite countries in the world, and the Middle East. Tell us what Cleartrip sees happening in those areas and give us an idea. Also, give us the sort of the 50-cent tour of Cleartrip.
Sure. So Cleartrip, I think we are in our 14th year now. We've started in India, and about 5-6 years back, we've ventured into the shores outside the Indian shores and went into the Middle East as well. So today we are present in 8 countries, India, UAE and Saudi Arabia being the 3 largest, and also some of the smaller countries in the GCC as well as Egypt. We primarily are an air OTA, and what we've seen over the last few months with COVID obviously has been significantly bad for all players in the ecosystem, airlines, hotels, OTA as well.
Don't worry. If we get a little hiccup in there, it's okay. It's Skype.
I got a call in the middle, and I don't know if you lost my video.
Yeah, I lost your video for a second, but that's okay. Let's just keep going because this is Skype, and this is not a Bruce Willis movie, so we'll just keep going.
Right. So, as I said, Cleartrip is in 8 countries, India and the Middle East, and COVID has been significantly devastating for the entire travel sector. It's affected hotels, it's affected airlines, as well as OTAs. But what we're seeing is green shoots of recovery. I think the first market within the markets that we operate in to open up was India. And India has been now live since sometime in May. We are seeing a reasonable amount of transactions. Obviously, if you were to compare that to pre-COVID levels, you're possibly at a 30% level, the whole Indian market. A combination of factors there. One to do with the capacity that the domestic aviation sector has come back online. I think that's at a lower level, as well as I think there is intent to travel that's lower as well. People are doing mostly emergency travel, and given all the circumstances that have affected livelihood, corporate travel, leisure, all of that has been impacted. So that's the level that we are seeing operations today. From a Middle East standpoint, we are seeing the Saudi has a large domestic market as well. So we are seeing a good recovery in our business in Saudi Arabia. We operate a different brand in Saudi Arabia called Fly-In, and that's a large OTA within that market, and that's seen reasonably good traction in terms of recovery. We are seeing green shoots extremely early in the Middle East as well. We expect as more and more international flights get operational, as the intra-GCC travel gets more functional post-COVID, I think you should start seeing significant emergence of travel there as well, right? So these are the various markets that we operate in, and each of them are at various stages in terms of recovery post-COVID.
Let's talk about India, because I really, as we've talked about, I think it's one of my favorite countries. I know it's one of my favorite countries. The government they want a strong aviation industry. I noticed the other day they were trying to do some things with the MRO, the tax situation, things like that. One of my favorite things to say about India is it suffers from democracy because you've got so many different state governments that have their own systems and everything else. But it's interesting to me, they're trying to promote aviation with the UDAN, the Regional Connectivity Scheme. But also then they also say, okay, we're going to impose price caps on airfares. Give us an idea, can the aviation industry survive with the heavy hand of the Indian government on there?
So I think the aviation is one of the sectors which probably has, from a pricing standpoint, is not really regulated. I think the UDAN scheme came with specific riders. And if you wanted the government help in terms of supporting financially for operating sectors that are less viable, and if you're taking the government financial backing, then there were fare caps. A lot of UDAN flights that are operational by the Indian carriers were actually without governmental support. which allowed them to operate free market pricing. And that's how Indian aviation has actually prospered very well over the last few years. As you might know, the story on Indian aviation growth has been phenomenal. India was the fastest growing air market in the world. We would have been number 3 somewhere in 22, 23. But obviously, all of that has been pushed back because of COVID. And all of that has happened because of intense competitive environment and a free competitive environment that's been fostered as far as the aviation sector is concerned. Yes, there are taxes, there are other regulatory hurdles that airlines have to go through, but from a pricing angle and from what they do for customers, it's fairly unregulated to a large extent. And I think from a current standpoint, given that most of the travel demand that we see emerging post-COVID, the environment is going to be very, very different from what it was pre. The government did also impose some ceiling and flow caps for flights that kind of emerged post the COVID lockdown. But I'm seeing the airlines have a pretty large band to operate in, and pretty much it's free for all within that as well.
Let me jump in with a quick question here about Indigo. I mean, we just saw, I think it was today or yesterday, they announced that they were going to lay off 10% of their workforce. There have been a few bankruptcies in India. I think, what was it, King Air? Kingfisher, sorry. And which was a very interesting story. How are things going with the airlines there? I mean, we had problems with the Pratt & Whitney, your turbofan engines. Now COVID-19. I mean, it's not really the fault of the carriers, but what is the situation for the carriers there?
So, given that all the growth over the last few years that I spoke about, I think the aviation space has been really brutal for operators as well, right? Because there was so much growth coming in. India is price sensitive in most sectors, and aviation is, when you're growing so fast, you need more and more new flyers to come in, an extremely price sensitive environment that they operated under, which kind of didn't allow most operators to kind of build up a lot of cash on their balance sheet. And the reality of COVID has hit everyone really hard. Very well capitalized airlines are doing well as well. So there are a lot of weak players within the Indian ecosystem, and all of them are doing really, really badly at this point of time. I think the multiple reports that are coming out in the sector kind of indicates that we should be expecting a few more airline bankruptcies or closures or mergers and acquisitions to happen within the space. Consolidation will happen, or a few more players will go down. Indigo is the largest carrier, which is financially has probably the best cash on the balance sheet. I think the second player that most people feel confident about is Vistara, given that they have backing of the large Tata group behind them. And Air India is kind of sovereign backed, right? So the government is going to step in and support, though we have seen recently that Air India has announced wage cuts and sending people home on leave without pay and so on and so forth as well. So the other private players are significantly constrained from a cash and balance sheet standpoint, and we're all keeping our fingers crossed that they should be able to raise enough equity and find enough liquidity to kind of tide over the situation.
Cleartrip is a huge booking engine, and you guys are doing a great job. I remember specifically on a recent IATA media call that they talked about people booking flights, and they said that what they were doing was that they were booking them closer to the time that they would fly. So instead of booking 20 days in advance or 30 days in advance, they were actually doing something like 2 or 3 days in advance. Is that what you see across your markets?
So from OTA standpoint, I think what we did see from an India domestic standpoint was that maybe 60% of my bookings was happening within 2 weeks of departure, but the 40% was happening outside that. From an international standpoint, I think about 50% of what I sell is within 30 days, 50% is outside 30 days. So there's a significant level of advanced purchase behavior that happens within the OTA environment, and specifically the Cleartrip environment.
Now, everybody's been talking about bubbles, travel bubbles, channels. I was talking to someone today, and they were talking about China, Singapore. Is India doing it? And actually, I know for a fact, India has been setting up these same things with the U.S. recently.
That's right. So I think what was happening post-COVID was that Air India was operating a bunch of repatriation flights, and I think the government has now or is in the process of establishing bilateral contracts. We've heard the news of American carriers operating from India from a post-COVID and repatriation flight environment standpoint. I think Lufthansa is operating as well. And the government has announced last week that we should be expecting more such bilateral agreements, which will allow pretty much carriers from both countries to operate bidirectionally, right? So we're expecting France, we're expecting the UK, we're expecting a bunch of other countries within the Middle East as well as Southeast Asia to kind of start opening up for flights to and from India.
Well, how is the traffic right now? I mean, is the inbound traffic okay? Is it a standstill? I mean, what's going on with that?
The reality of the situation on the ground is that there are people who are stuck in both ends of the spectrum at this point of time, right? So there are a lot of people who are Indian expats, students, etc., who are stuck in various countries overseas. There are a lot of people of Indian origin who are stuck in India and really want to get back to their home countries. When I say home countries, it's the place of work or the place of residence that they have. And all the flights operating today are pretty much strong bidirectionally. And I think what is important for us to understand is how long will that last? Will it be for a short time because there's a lot of pent-up demand that those flights are going well? Will it be sustained over the period of next few months as capacity increases? Will we see that sustained demand? Those are factors that, frankly, it's too early to say at this point of time. But my view is that there is a significant economic interest between India and a lot of these countries where flights are being set up, right? And we should see that panning out in terms of demand as well as capacity loads that airlines are able to fill up their aircraft with as well.
Let me ask you this. I mean, IATA, ICAO, all the big organizations have been working very hard to promote aviation and to tell everybody that, look, airplanes are safe. It's safe to fly, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, right now, everything that aviation is going through, it's not an aviation problem. It's a health problem. It's a medical problem. It's a call it whatever you want to, but it's not like it's not like it's an unsafe plane or anything. What can aviation organizations like IATA or the government in India, the regulator in India, what can they do to help break down the quarantines and the barriers to flying right now?
So I think from a regulatory standpoint, be it IATAs, be it governments, I think what is important is to be careful about, obviously, the post-COVID travel, but also ease up regulations with respect to quarantine rules, with respect to how people get tested, right? So a lot of countries or airports are still insisting on having safe to travel pre-COVID tests done before traveling. Can the traveler take that at the airport in like 30 minutes? They get a result. Can they take it at the departure airport? Can they take it at the destination airport? And hence eases the pain of the passenger from traveling. I think there's a bunch of those kind of regulatory environment issues that can be sorted by IATA and the governments. I think also within standardized norms in terms of how travelers need to be traveling, because I think every city or every airport has a set of norms post-COVID, both with respect to safety, with respect to how soon you need to get to the airport, because there are so many other hoops that you need to run through and so on and so forth. I think some kind of regulatory environment, and more importantly, I think a lot of airports are, while there is a massive adoption of technology today, I think there is still a lot more touch points that are still prevalent in international travel, right? How many of those touch points can go into touchless points, barcodes, having some kind of verification for travelers that allows them to lessen the pain and the time that they spend at the airport, especially with all these new health checks that are happening as well. I think those are some of the factors that I think the environment can do, both from a regulatory environment from IATA, ICAO, as well as the governments as well. Apart from that, I think the dissemination of a lot of information on what's changed post-COVID will be up to the players. I think airlines are doing a phenomenal job in terms of communicating what's changed, how safe they are. Players such as ourselves are taking an effort in terms of communicating a lot of factors that is prevalent at this time. For instance, Cleartrip, we have launched something called Travel Safe. That's a page that gives you information on a lot of details. What happens at the airport? On the way to the airport, do you have cabs available? Once you get to the airport, what is required, right? So, for instance, in India, it is mandatory for you to download the Arogya Setu app before you get to the airport, or you need to give a self-declaration form. There's a lot of procedural stuff that's changed post-COVID. We have taken on that to kind of give that information to passengers. What sectors are open, right? So a lot of sectors are open for sale, but are flights really operational on those sectors? Um, uh, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a lot of that information. And also with respect to airline policies, I think a lot of airlines have made flexible policies available, but passengers are still not aware whether they're going to get their money back. Are they going to be forced into a credit shell over a 12-month, 24-month period, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a lot of information that needs to be disseminated. And I think other players apart from governments, need to be involved in disseminating that information as well.
Well, it's a lot of information, but it's also a lot of things to do. I mean, I remember when I started flying. I mean, you could still smoke on an airplane, but now I've got to log on. I've got to do something with my mobile phone. I've got to download an application. I've got to do all this other stuff. Is it getting too difficult to fly? Are we turning off passengers?
So I think that the need to fly is a sentiment that will be sustained. At this point of time, maybe the need to fly at will for leisure might be overwhelmed with, or will be kind of subsumed with everything that's happening in the environment at this point of time, and possibly people who are in dire need to travel. And that could be, I mean, there could be some emergency situations. It could be other reasons as well. When I say dire, it doesn't have to be, at the utmost emergency. So what my firm belief is that the initial people who are traveling in this environment are people who need to travel. It will start getting substituted with work travel as well as leisure travel, and these are more at-will travel as I see it, and that's a continuum, right? Like a lot of changes that have happened in the aviation sector over the last 25, 30 years, right? There's been a lot of rules, there are a lot of regulatory environment changes, safety norms that used to be there, and so on and so forth. I think travelers catch up very, very quickly. And once they catch up, I think we should see a resurgence of demand as well. The current environment, I think, is more conducive for emergency travel, as I said. As the panic around COVID kind of settles down, as more and more people get immune to the disease, as the virus changes, or if a vaccine comes out, I very, very firmly believe that we should start seeing the next upsurge in travel over the next 2 to 3 years. Yes, it might take us a little bit of time. Who knows whether it's 12 months or 24 months to get back to pre-COVID levels, but I think we're on the cusp of seeing that emergence of a fast-paced growth mode again, subsequent to all of the settling down.
Balu, let me ask you about the Middle East for a minute. I mean, I fly on Qatar a lot. We go from Singapore to France quite often, and we've built up quite a few miles on the airline. And India has a very close relationship with the Middle East carriers, Emirates, Qatar, Etihad, etc. And Cleartrip has actually you have a position there, you have an operation there. How's the Middle East doing? How are those guys doing? Because they're basically all international. Sorry for that. That was I don't know if you heard that. But the Middle East carriers, they're all international carriers. They don't have any domestic market. How are they doing?
So I think that a big chunk of the inventory and the network that the Middle East carriers have built, as you said, is running those very, very large airplanes, around the world, and transporting their people and providing those pipes. But the reality is that that region also does have regional traffic, right? So there's a lot of travel that happens within the GCC countries themselves. There's a lot of travel that happens between, say, India to the GCC, for instance, which is very, very point to point. So my sense is that like every other airline today, the Middle Eastern carriers also need to rethink their business model. They need to rethink, and we've already seen some signs of that, right? Emirates has announced that they might not be flying all the A380s that they have access to. They're going to change. They're getting smaller aircraft coming in. My sense is that we might see a lot of narrow body operations as well getting inducted by the Middle Eastern carriers to end up operate in the post-COVID new norm, right? So wherever there is point-to-point traffic, I think there will be a different kind of aircraft, a different kind of network that will come into their play. And I think that's the evolution that we will see. Over the last few years, we have seen the emergence of a lot of low-cost carriers within the Middle East region as well, right? You're talking about the Air Arabias and the Fly Dubais and the Nas Airs and the Saudi Gulfs of the world. And these are all narrow-body operations, and they are actually opening up that region for short-haul traffic. And my sense is that the opportunity is there, and some of the larger guys like the Emirates or the Etihads or the Qatars are going to kind of capitalize on that opportunity as well as we move forward.
Balu, finally, we always try to end these in conversation shows on a positive note. COVID-19, it's obviously a very serious situation. Millions of people have lost their jobs in the aviation industry, and not to, a lot of people have died. But is there a bright spot for aviation from where you sit in all this? Is there something that the aviation industry can look forward to?
My view is that over the last few years, and especially from a India standpoint, for instance, I see that there's a huge awareness that the population has in terms of how travel is not a necessity anymore. Sorry, travel is not an emergency. It's not to be done once in a few years anymore. It is a necessity. It is it's a way of life, right? So especially for the younger population, for the millennials, you would see that, traveling at the drop of the hat had become common. Right? And whether that's a 4-hour flight or whether it's a 2-hour flight or a 6-hour flight didn't really matter, right? There were people traveling out of India for a long weekend, for a 3-day break, and which was, when I was a teenager, I couldn't imagine people doing that, right? You had these few instances of people who had ever been overseas, and now you throw a stone and you will hit someone who's been overseas, and that's really to do with a change in lifestyle. And as I mentioned earlier, travel has become a necessity. It's a part of how people kind of unwind and learn new things. And I think that is here to stay. It is a kind of disturbance that's come in because of COVID. The environment, as soon as the environment becomes safe and secure again, I think we are going to see a resurgence of travel back. And the idea is that all the players in the industry today need to hang in there, right? Whether that's for a few months, hopefully, and we are all keeping our fingers crossed for that to be as short as possible. And with all the vaccines and everything else that we are hearing about, we are all extremely positive in terms of re-emergence of travel and the traveler back up in the skies again as soon as possible.
We all hope so. Balu Ramachandran, Global Head for the Air Business at Cleartrip. Thanks for joining me in conversation.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure being here, and I really enjoyed our chat.